Okay, so um, I'm just gonna in this video go over lecture 3 and all of lecture 4. These are examples of afferent circuits. Afferent, remember, means going up to the CNS. So I'm gonna go over those examples. Um, and so there'll be a few that I go through. I'll start with the one from lecture 3. Um, I'll just remind you what I told you in class, that these are the examples of different afferent signals, and they're going to help you understand how signals are carried up to the CNS. You'll realize some of these in blue here travel up spinal nerves. So, for example, crude touch on your finger, we'll see that crude touch means a touch that is diffuse and that you can't really tell what the object is. It's not like feeling an object and figuring out what it is. It's, for example, someone brushing up against you and not really figuring out what the object is, but a crude touch, a non localized touch on your pinky finger. That information goes up the spinal cord. It makes sense. Your arms are pretty close to your spinal cord, so it'll go there. Position of your left leg. Your left leg, right? Understanding the proprioception, where your leg is in space, that also will send information up to your spinal cord. The legs are close to the spinal cord. Fine touch on your shin. Your shin will send a neuron, and that information, that afferent, will go up into the spinal cord. Remember, this is fine touch, by the way, and fine touch really is a sense of understanding what the object is. So maybe a soccer ball hit your shin and you were able to tell what that object was. Fine touch is not the same as crude touch. All three of these are going to enter the spinal cord, but then you have some sensations that actually go directly into the brain. And those are called cranial nerves that are carrying them into the brain directly, not spinal nerves. And an example of this would be taste on the tip of your tongue. Remember, I said anything that's above your neck, right? Except for a few little exceptions. Those will enter cranial nerves. So, taste on the tip of your tongue, that is above your neck, that will be sensed through a cranial nerve. Blood gas levels, right? This one's a bit of an exception. These blood gas levels, this is autonomic information, right? This will be sensed, actually go directly into the brainstem at the medulla, and directly go into the brain. And then there are some sensations that actually could go through either spinal nerves or the brain directly through a cranial nerve, depending on what is going on in the body. For example, stretching of your stomach. If you have a bit of food in your stomach, right, the cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, which goes to a lot of your visceral organs, that will carry information up about how stretched your stomach is. If there's a bit of food, it'll send that signal up. But if you eat 5 bowls of pasta and your stomach is overstretching, then that will actually send a painful discomfort signal, and that signal will go through neurons that are that are you have nociceptors that detect pain, right? And that'll be relayed up spinal nerves. So this stomach stretching, depending on how stretched it is, that could go either way. It could be the spinal cord or the brain. So the next thing I tell you is that when signals are sent through the spinal nerves, right? If they go to the spinal cord first, this is your list of questions you're going to ask yourself. If signals are sent through cranial nerves, this is the list of questions you will ask yourself. And we'll go through them one by one for each of these examples that I gave you, and it'll help you to understand the pathway. Here's our table of contents. Okay, so this we're going to talk about afferent signals traveling through spinal nerves. First, I'm going to tell you about crude touch on your pinky, then the fine touch on your shin, and then the position of your leg. But I want you to understand how this is organized. First, I'll talk about these three signals which are traveling through spinal nerves. Then I'm going to show you these two signals that are traveling through cranial nerves. And then I'm going to show you this stomach one where there's a bit of spinal nerves and a bit of cranial nerves that are involved in this. It depends on where we're going. So first things first, afferent signals that travel through the spinal nerves. These are your list of questions you're going to ask yourself. What is the stimulus and what receptors pick up that specific stimulus? Which nerve plexus is involved? Can you use a dermatome map to figure this out? Which rami and root does the signal use? Which nuclei in the spinal gray matter picks up the signal? Which white matter column carries the signal? Which CNS structures relay the signal, and is this perceived, right? Are you cognizant and aware that this is happening? So this is your line of questioning that you'll ask. We're going to see three different examples of a stimulus. First one is crude touch on the pinky. The next one is fine touch on your shin. And the other one is position of your left leg. So we're going to go through these one by one. This is just an overview of all the some of the information that you'll see. Touch, usually crude touch or fine touch, these receptors are mechanoreceptors that detect changes in mechanical force, right? Distortions in the membrane. Position of your left leg, these are called proprioceptors. These detect the limb position, right? These receptors send information to a spinal plexus. If it's in the arm, such as the pinky, we know that that goes up the brachial plexus, right? If it's on the lower leg, like the shin example, we know that that goes up the sacral plexus. And here I just told you the left leg position, right? So we don't really know if it's the lumbar plexus, meaning the upper leg, or the sacral plexus, meaning the lower leg. So we'll just say both over here. Now, if you, the ultimate destination, if you are perceiving this, if you are aware that something has touched you or that your limb is somewhere, then it will go to the cerebral cortex. For example, when something touches your pinky, crude touch, that will be perceived, so that will go to the cerebral cortex. If you have fine touch on your shin, you do perceive that, so that does go to the cerebral cortex. And your position of your leg, if you're thinking about where your leg is in space, like you're learning, I don't know, a new dance move or how to bike for the first time, then you're going to need to be aware of where your leg is in space. That will go to the cerebral cortex. But sometimes, we get so used to a certain movement that we forget to think about where our legs are, and we just do it naturally, such as biking. At one point, you don't think of the position of your legs in space. So in that case, it would not go to the cerebral cortex, and we'd actually see it go to a lower brain region. It would stop in the brain stem. We're going to take a look at that example. I take that back. It will not go to the brainstem. It will go to the cerebellum. We're going to take a look at that in a minute. So the first part here, the afferent signals that travel to the spinal nerve. Let's look at the crude touch on your pinky. This is part of lecture 3. So crude touch on the right pinky finger is, crude touch to begin with is a poorly localized crude touch sensation. Mechanoreceptors in your pinky finger, detect this distortion. It enters the brachial plexus since it is part of the arm, and it enters in spinal nerve T1, right? The ultimate destination, since this is a conscious sensation, this will enter the cerebral cortex, and we're going to see that it's going to go into primary somatosensory cortex. So first thing, over here, crude touch on your pinky finger. What is the stimulus, right? The stimulus is crude touch on the pinky finger. As I said, it's a poorly localized touch sensation. Little dendrites over here pick up this general touch to the pinky and send information up. So an example of crude touch is someone lightly brushes against your pinky while walking past you. You are conscious that your pinky was touched, but you can't identify where on the pinky it touched it, the object's shape. You can't identify its texture, right? It was just a quick, brief touch, general area. What receptors pick up that specific stimuli? You're going to be stimulating mechanoreceptors on your pinky. The signal travels along a single unipolar neuron towards the spinal cord, right? Axons bundle together and collect into, do you see this is one neuron, this is another one. They bundle up together into a peripheral nerve, right? They all of these different mechanoreceptors, they come together and bundle into this peripheral nerve, many axons together. They don't merge and become the same axon, but they bundle together, just like lanes of a highway all coming in together, right? Next, what dermatome does this signal belong to? Well, a signal from the pinky is picked up by T. If I look at my dermatome here, do you see T1 over here? The pinky, right? That will be the dermatome. T1 is also on the back of the hand, right? And so T1 picks up this information. The mechanoreceptors are located here, and they will send info up via this ulnar nerve over here. You don't need to know the ulnar nerve. I'm just showing you that there's different names for these, right? So this will go up this nerve here and go into T1, right? In the spinal cord, it will enter the T1 spinal nerve. What nerve plexus is involved? The T1 spinal nerve goes through the brachial plexus. We know by definition the brachial plexus, C5 through T1, innervates the pectoral girdles and the arms. If this information comes from your arms, it will for sure enter the brachial plexus, right? The cervical plexus was for the neck. The lumbar plexus was for the upper leg. The sacral plexus was for the lower leg. So this crude touch on your pinky finger will go in the brachial plexus. Now I'm going to ask you, which rami does the signal use? Since the pinky finger is part of the limbs, we know that the limbs send information through the ventral ramus, right? The dorsal ramus is only for the back region, the sensations that are in the back of your torso. So this signal will go up the ventral ramus. Which route does the signal use? Since this is a sensory signal, the unipolar neuron passes from the spinal nerve to the dorsal root. So remember, here is, you're going to have the limbs feeding into this ventral ramus, right? Not the dorsal one, the ventral ramus, and then it becomes the spinal nerve over here, right? But then it needs to make a decision. Does it go in the dorsal root or in the ventral root, right? And so over here we remember that when you're in the spinal nerve, right, the somatosensory neurons that detect touch, that are sensory, right, they always go in the dorsal root, right? This is unipolar neurons going into the dorsal root. They put their cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies, and this is the dorsal root. The dorsal root is always going to be sensory info, right? So actually this information from the limbs, right, would go into this ventral ramus, and then once it gets to the spinal nerve here, it would decide to go into the dorsal root, like this, right? So it'll pick the ventral ramus and then the dorsal root. All right. So next piece of information, right? Which nuclei in the spinal gray matter picks up this information, right? A crude touch is considered a somatic sensory signal. So the signals will synapse onto neurons in the this somatic sensory nuclei. This gray matter, remember, is a bunch of nuclei. So here's my little neuron, right, that picked up crude touch on my pinky. Here's its cell body over here. It'll continue, burp, burp, burp. And because this is a somatic sensory signal, it will make a synapse over here on the somatic sensory nuclei in this region. And remember that all of this region here, right, is called the dorsal horn, right? Dorsal horn. And the dorsal horn is the region, recall, where sensory info goes to, right? This is motor stuff, so we don't care about that for the moment. But this is sensory region. This is visceral sensory. Visceral means like your visceral organs. This is not a visceral organ. This is touch from your finger. It's somatic sensory, right? Which white matter column carries the signal? If you go back to into this lecture 3, you'll realize the columns when you're deciding. It's a bit annoying, but we know that the secondary neuron, right? So information came over here. It's synapsed here onto this other neuron over here. And we know that the second neuron carrying somatic sensory signals, if it needs to go up to the brain, right? And we know that crude touch and pressure crosses the gray, it'll cross the gray commissure and it'll go up the ventral columns, right? So it'll actually go up this way and it'll go up to the brain. I didn't draw this well in 3D, but once it enters the white columns, it turns upwards and then it goes up to the brain. You will not be responsible for knowing where or if signals cross to the opposite side, but I want you to know that crossing always does happen, and it happens either over here in the gray commissure, it'll cross to the other side, or it'll often happen up in the medulla oblongata. That's a place where you'll get some crossing at times as well. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. Okay, so next thing. Over here, the next question to ask is which CNS structures relay the signal, and is it perceived or not, right? So, as I said, signals entered the spinal cord dorsally and synapsed onto neurons in the dorsal horn. The second order neurons, in this case, they cross the gray commissure, right, to the other side, and the neurons entered the ventral white columns, right, white matter columns, turning upwards and projected up. They will always go up to the thalamus, right? These columns always carry info, usually to the thalamus, to synapse onto this other neuron. And remember, the thalamus over here is the gatekeeper. It could decide to filter out and ignore this white neuron, this signal that came over here, and not care that something is brushing on the finger. Let's say something keeps brushing on your finger for the rest of the day. You'll eventually ignore it, right? So the thalamus could shut that down and not send an action potential down this neuron. It'll stay over here in this neuron and ignore it. The second thing the thalamus could do is it could allow the signal to continue up to the cortex, And this will be perceived in this region of primary somatosensory cortex, right? It'll go to the finger region of the cortex. So this is kind of the route. And I'll just remind you again, here the signal crossed in the gray commissure, right? But you don't need to know that this crossing occurs at this level. All you need to know is crossings can occur here or they could occur in the medulla, and that's all you need to know. Okay. Next thing, which CNS structures relay the signal and is it perceived, right? So neurons from the spinal cord, right? Remember the spinal cord, it came up, goes to the thalamus. The thalamus decides whether or not the signal should go up to the brain. If it does decide to send a signal, it sends the neuron up. And the neuron that it goes to, the thalamus sends this crude touch on the pinky. This is a sensation, a somatosensation, right? So this will go to primary somatosensory cortex over here, right? It will not go to primary visual cortex. It will not go to primary auditory cortex. It'll go up to primary somatosensory cortex. Then many neurons from primary somatosensory cortex synapse onto somatosensory association cortex. Remember, this is the associating one, and this will be the end of the pathway. So remember, primary somatosensory cortex says, I feel this little thing in this patch of skin. I feel crude touch in this patch of skin. But all of those neurons in the entire pinky finger, right, will then synapse onto this somatosensory association area and say, this large object all across your pinky finger was brushed upon by something, right? And it'll all associate those inputs in this area, this association cortex. All right, the next one is fine touch on your shin. So, what dermatome does this signal belong to? The shin, right? The front of your shin. A signal on the shin is picked up by L5 or S1, right? That's the shin section. Technically, you could say L4 as well. What nerve plexus is involved, right? These nerves come, we know that the shin is the lower leg, right? So we know that that's the sacral plexus. We know the sacral plexus is T12 to L4. That's the lower leg, right? Okay, this is actually wrong over here. I should be writing about the sacral plexus here. My bad. So just disregard the lumbar plexus. I should be talking about the sacral plexus. Okay. Next question. Which rami does the signal use, right? So you need to think about whether this is coming from the front of the body, the back, or the limbs. I'll give you 2 seconds to think about it. Okay, so over here, right, you have information, your shin is part of a limb, so it will go through the ventral rami and it'll enter into the spinal cord, right? Just like our other crude touch on the pinky, that came from an upper limb, right? Which root does this signal use? Again, this is sensory signals, right? So this information must go through the dorsal root, right? And all the cell bodies will accumulate in the dorsal root ganglion, right, over here. Which nuclei in the spinal gray matter picks up the signal, right? In this case, touch signals go up the dorsal white matter column, and they actually don't synapse in the spinal cord gray matter, right? If they did synapse, you would think that they would synapse in the somatic sensory area, right? But they actually don't. They go right away into the dorsal columns. So they enter, they go into the dorsal columns, whoop, all the way up, and they synapse higher up in the medulla and the brainstem, and they cross over there actually. So we'll take a look at that in a minute, but don't worry too much about the details, as I said, if it crosses or not, right? In this case, the dorsal columns, they just enter directly, and then they cross later on in the medulla. But again, if they were to synapse, you know that it would be somatic sensory, because this is touch information, right? Not visceral sensory info. Which white matter column carries the signal? Go look at the list of the different columns and what goes up each. Because this is a signal about fine touch, it will be carried up along the dorsal columns over here in the spinal cord's white matter, right? So let me draw over here. Info will enter, there will be the cell body from the shin neuron, and then it'll go over here, and then it'll veer upwards into the dorsal column, right? Again, you don't need to know where things cross or not, right? Just know that they do, and it'll happen either in the gray commissure or up in the medulla. Okay. Which CNS structures relay the signal, and is it perceived, right? So this signal will cross to the opposite side of the brainstem of the medulla, and it'll reach the thalamus, right? So it synapses in the medulla, crosses over, goes up a bit more to the thalamus, and then again, the thalamus will decide whether or not it wants to hear from this signal. If you perceive this sensation, it will reach the cerebral cortex, right? It'll reach, so you see it go up the thalamus, right? Then it would go to primary somatosensory cortex, since this is a touch feeling, a somatosensation. And then all of those neurons would convey together onto somatosensory association cortex and say, these little patches of skin tell me altogether that this is a round spherical object that hit my shin. This is probably a soccer ball, right? So they'll maybe integrate all of this together. This diagram over here is not actually super accurate, right? Because this neuron over here should actually be turning and going to the shin area over here. So it should be going to this region of somatosensory cortex. I just realized that now. All right. What's next? Last signal of the spinal nerves is this position of your left leg, okay? So if I want to know the position of my left leg, what dermatome does this signal belong to? Although proprioception is not a cutaneous signal, it's not on your skin, you can still use your dermatome map, right? Positional information is determined by proprioceptors, right? Meaning the little receptors in muscle tendons and joints. And this will come from the lower and upper leg over here, right? So it'll be, the dermatome used will be anything from, it'll be any of these over here. I see some L1s all the way to S5, right? What plexus is involved, right? So for this one, you have the upper and the lower limbs, so you will need the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus. Which rami does the signal use? Since the leg is part of the limbs again, right? This will travel through the ventral rami. It'll go through this rami over here and enter this way. Which route does the signal use? Since this is a sensory signal, the neuron goes again through the dorsal root. This won't change for afferents. It'll put its cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglia. Now, this is where things get a bit complicated. If the limb position is perceived, okay, perceived proprioception, which nuclei in the spinal gray matter picks up the signal? If the limb position is perceived, this signal does not synapse on a spinal gray matter nuclei. It'll go and enter here. It will veer in the gray matter. It'll turn around. It'll enter into the dorsal columns and go up, just like fine touch. Okay. So which white matter column, if it is perceived, the proprioceptive signal will be carried along these dorsal columns over here. All right. If the limb position is not perceived, right, then this neuron will come in, it'll synapse onto in the somatic sensory nuclei in the dorsal horn, and it will send another neuron, it'll cross the gray commissure, and it will go across, and it'll actually go up these lateral columns over here on the sides. If you're having difficulty knowing when and where it's gonna go up in the white matter columns, don't worry about it yet. I'm gonna show you a diagram that summarizes this all at the end of this lecture, okay? So just make sure you know what information goes where in the columns. I think that I showed you in lecture 3, and that can help you out. The next question, which CNS structures relay the signal and is it perceived? If this is perceived and I perceive my limb position in space, right? I'm learning how to dance and I need to figure out where my leg is in space. If it's perceived, it goes up the dorsal columns, as I said. It'll go up the dorsal columns. It will then cross in the medulla, right? It'll go up to the thalamus and then up to the cerebral cortex. And again, it should go to the leg region, right? This neuron should be pointing to the leg region. So to the thalamus, up to the primary somatosensory cortex. I'm perceiving it. So it needs to go to the cortex, right? And we know that somatosensation does go up over here to the primary somatosensory cortex. Then that information will synapse onto the somatosensory association area, this somatosensory association cortex here. And it'll say, oh, your entire leg is going in this pedaling motion, right? You're biking right now. You're learning how to bike, let's say. Or you're learning to do this weird dance move. If you're not perceiving this proprioceptive information, right? And let's say you're walking in the street, right? You're still sending signals to your brain, but you're not perceiving it. It doesn't need to go to the cortex. So as I said, this information will actually be sent up, will synapse in the somatic sensory nuclei. It'll cross over the gray commissure or not. It doesn't matter. It'll go up, cross the medulla, right? These are called the lateral columns on the sides, and they will send information to the cerebellum, which is in the back of the body, and that helps with balance and movement coordination, right? In an involuntary way. So here is my little neuron going to the cerebellum. I don't even need to pass through the thalamus because it's not going to the cortex. So now we're going to look at, we saw afferent signals that go up through spinal nerves. Now I want to go through some examples of signals that go through cranial nerves. And for the most part, it is any signals coming from above the neck. Of course, there are some exceptions, and you could go back to your cranial nerves that we looked at in the previous lecture and see what exactly each cranial nerve that sends sensory info distributes. Um, Taste on the tip of your tongue. This is an example of a sensation that is um, in the how can I say it, above the neck region, right? Blood gas levels is a bit of the weird one. We're gonna see a cranial nerve that is, this is a bit of an exception. This is a visceral signal, right? So we'll take a look at that one. So when you have information sent up cranial nerves, um, there's a few questions that we want to ask ourselves. So first of all, what is the stimulus? What receptors are picking up that stimulus? Still the same question that we had in the spinal nerves, right? But now we're not going up a spinal nerve. We're going to ask which cranial nerve transmits these sensory signals. The next question is which brain structure receives this signal? And the last question is which CNS structures relay the signal? And is this perceptible or not perceived sensation? So, this is a bit of the overview. The taste on the tip of your tongue, right? The front portion of your tongue, that's going to be detected by chemoreceptors. Enters the facial nerve up to the cortex because we can perceive this sensation. Detecting blood gas, we're going to see is occurs via chemoreceptors in the aortic branches, the carotid sinuses. We're going to talk about this a little bit. And these carotid sinuses can detect the chemicals of oxygen or the chemicals of CO2 if they're high or low. And this can signal via the glossopharyngeal nerve up to the brainstem and say, hey, these blood gas levels are low. I don't think any of you can right now tell me what level of gas your blood is at, which means it is not perceived, which means it doesn't go up to the cortex. So it must stay in that simpler region of the brain, in the ice cream cone, right? So it stays in the brainstem, specifically in the medulla oblongata. The medulla is very important for many autonomic functions, such as controlling blood gas levels, controlling breathing, controlling the heart rate. All of this happens in the medulla, so we'll take a look at that. Let's start with the taste on the tip of your tongue. So, two questions here. Which of the cranial nerves transmits this sensory info? If you look at your little last lecture, and you'll notice that it is the facial nerve, right? Cranial nerve number 7 that transmits sensory signals from your taste buds um, on the front 2/3 of the tongue, right? So this is the definition of this facial cranial nerve. So this problem is asking us on the tip of the tongue. That makes sense why we have the front 2/3 of the tongue, right? That's the tip of the tongue. That's the facial nerve. The posterior part of the tongue is transmitted via a separate cranial nerve. This cranial nerve in green here, this facial nerve that goes from the tongue, will go, you actually see it over here, it'll go into, carries information into the pons. This detail doesn't matter too much where in the pons it's going to. And again, you know that taste is going to be sent up to the brain because we perceive it, right? And tasting, sight, and sound are typically sensations that we perceive, so they are relayed to the cerebral cortex, past the thalamus, if the thalamus allows it to send up the info. Taste will reach, information about taste enters the thalamus and is relayed to primary gustatory cortex. Remember that this was the area in the insula where taste is sent first. Now, taste is a bit weird. Taste doesn't go to a gustatory association area, it actually goes to this prefrontal cortex. So it then sends a neuron to the prefrontal cortex, which does not have any related association area. Um, Prefrontal cortex, you could think of it as a little bit as a association area. I'm going to talk about what it is in a second. Um, so let's talk about it over here. What are integrative centers? Okay. Another name for integrative centers, it says it in its name, it integrates a lot of information in this center, right? Another name for it is multimodal association area. Multi, because it has multiple modes, multiple modalities, multiple senses, such as vision, somatosensation. It brings together all of the sensations, right? So it's multimodal association area. So these connections in these areas, they cause the emergence of higher functions in integrative centers. For example, you're bringing together all these senses, right? And you could allow for things like memory, planning, intellect, language, emotions, perceiving the world. All of these are much more complicated and require all of your senses together, right? So there are three that we really care about. The prefrontal cortex, the most frontal part of your brain, this is a very complicated region of your brain. It's a multimodal association area. And we'll see that there's actually a lot of parts of it that are there for judgment, for your personality. They used to lobotomize patients way back when, and this would destroy their personality basically. Um, Along there's also this posterior association area, and there's the limbic association areas deeper within the brain that you don't really see. So all of these three areas are integrative centers that bring together a bunch of senses. As I told you over here, the gustatory, the reason why I gave this example was it's a bit of an exception. Gustatory cortex doesn't have a specific association area, so it goes directly to the prefrontal cortex. Next example is blood gas levels. Okay, so for the blood gas levels, um, first of all, what type of cranial nerve transmits this? If you go look at your handy dandy list, this is the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9, right? It's located right over here. It sends sensory signals from the carotid sinus, where chemoreceptors detect blood gas levels. Here is the aorta. Here is the carotids, and in the sinus, this space in between, there's these little chemoreceptors here that detect low oxygen, or the opposite, high CO2, right? If your tissue is metabolizing a lot, it'll have low amounts of oxygen in your blood, right? If you're running, you're going to use up a lot of oxygen and you're going to produce a lot of CO2, right? So these will detect if there's a lot of metabolism going on and you're running out of oxygen and having too much CO2 in your blood. This signal will be sent up via the glossopharyngeal nerves, and they will go directly into the medulla oblongata over here. These this part of the brain stem, the medulla, has cardioregulatory centers in the medulla that can regulate um, certain aspects of oxygenation of blood. How does it do that? First of all, I want to state that what CNS structures relay the signal, and is it perceptible or not? We do not perceive levels of gases in our blood. As I told you, I don't think you can detect right now how much oxygen you have in your blood. Um, Parts of the brain stem, right? That means that it's not going to go up to the cerebral cortex. and instead it will synapse in lower parts of the ice cream cone of the brainstem, right, into the medulla oblongata, and that part of the brainstem receives the information, and it'll make adjustments to vital signs. I'm going to show you a sneak peek right now of what it does. The medulla will send efferents down, right? If the CO2 levels are too high and oxygen is too low, the medulla can make adjustments to our breathing and heart rates by triggering efferents, sending things out for the ANS. It can tell, for example, the heart to through this sympathetic nerve fiber to beat faster, or it could tell the heart to beat slower if there's too much oxygen, let's say. It can calm down the heart rate, right? So that's called the autonomic nervous system. We're gonna take a look at this a lot more and examine this a lot more in depth later on. But I wanted to show you some efferents to see what the medulla does with this information after. But again, right now we're talking about afferents, just the glossopharyngeal sending this info up, relaying how much CO2 and oxygen there is. This is, again, this is not perceived, so it's not going to the cerebral cortex. It is only going to the brainstem. It is only going to that medulla, right? And lastly, this weirdo over here is an afferent signal that can, some of them can travel through spinal nerves, or in different circumstances, these signals can travel through cranial nerves. And I'll explain exactly what that is. The example I'll give is stretching of your stomach. Okay. So when you have a small amount of stomach stretching, the regular gastric reflex happens. Your stomach stretches a little bit. Mechanoreceptors detect that stretch. The information is sent up the vagus nerve, the cranial nerve, and it will go to the brainstem, the medulla, and you won't even perceive that your stomach is being stretched, right? When you're eating, you don't feel your stomach being stretched. Now, if you eat too much, an excess amount of stomach stretching, right? Eating too much, nociceptors that are carrying painful stretch information from the stomach will go up spinal nerves and go to the cerebral cortex and relay information that this is painful. So this is a pure example where cranial and spinal nerves can be used for the same sensation. It's just different levels of it. Um, so signals from our internal organs are a little more complicated, right? Those visceral organs, because many afferent fibers innervate these organs. Visceral afferent signals could be transported by the cranial or the spinal ones. So as I told you, stretching of our stomach occurs in multiple stages. A small amount of food will trigger the cranial nerves, right? You eat a small portion, that doesn't hurt your belly. If you eat a shit ton of food, right? Too much food, we've all been there. You might get pain and uncomfort, right? And that's going to be sent up spinal nerves. So I want to go through both these cases to show you how these afferents are different. So first of all, a small amount of food triggers a stretch signal via cranial nerves. Let's look at this regular low amount of food signal to see what is going on. So which of the cranial nerves transmits this type of sensory info? Again, all of our visceral organs, you'll go and look at our little sheet. The vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, transmits stretching signals from your stomach wall to stimulate digestion and gastric secretions. So that will go up the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is very important. It conveys info about many visceral organs and how they are functioning, stretching, or different aspects of it, and they transmit that up the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve then carries info to the medulla, right? First. And which CNS structures relay the signal? Is it perceptible or imperceptible? When stretching of the wall only stimulates digestive processes, right? This is largely not perceived. As I said, you're eating, you're not going to think about your stomach stretching. So no cortical areas will be stimulated. However, we said over here, right, the medulla will get that signal. So you are not thinking of it. It will not go up to the cortex. Now, here's a little different scenario. Um, Excess amount of food, right? If we eat too much, we get a painful stimulus and we do perceive our stomach stretching. That's relayed up spinal nerves. So, what dermatome does this signal belong to? Since this signal is internal, we can't use the dermatome map, right? The stomach isn't part of a dermatome. The dermatomes only look at the outer somatic sensation on the skin, right? The cutaneous areas. Um, what nerve plexus is involved? As your stomach is in the abdominal cavity, this signal is carried by the thoracic nerves, no specific plexus, right? So again, this is a bit of a exception over here. These are, I don't care really much about the abdominal organs for the plexus, right? Don't worry too much about that. Um, let's see over here. Remember the pain pathway, pain and temperature sensations. Um, these will go and enter into the spinal cord, cross the gray commissure, and they will go up the lateral horns, burp, 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 all the way up to the thalamus. And then again, this should go, this arrow should go towards the stomach, right? Not the arms, but there's a region probably somewhere here that is the stomach. And it will convey that, hey, this is very painful. I feel my stomach stretching abnormally. Which RAMI does that signal use? Visceral sensory signals are not carried along the ventral or dorsal rami, but along other structures, which I'm not going to talk about right now. So again, I'm giving you a bit of a weird example, which is a visceral signal. We're going to talk about this when we talk about the autonomic system a bit more, okay? Visceral is from the inside. It's not from the back. It's not from the front. It's from the inside, right? Which route does the signal use? This we can answer. Since this is a sensory signal, a visceral sensory signal, right? Here, I made a mistake. This should say visceral sensory neuron, not somatosensory neuron. The neuron is going to go up the dorsal root, and their cell bodies, as usual, will collect in the dorsal root ganglia. So again, I'm just going to change this. This should say visceral sensory neuron, right, in green. And they will synapse, right, in the sensory nuclei, right? So in the dorsal horn, but in the visceral sensory nuclei, right? They're going to synapse over here in this region. Okay. Visceral, again, means internal organs. The stomach is an internal organ. Which white matter column carries the signal, right? So over here, you see the neuron coming in, synapsing. It crosses, as I said, the gray commissure, and it'll go up the lateral columns. Go look at what columns carry what info. The lateral columns will carry painful stimuli up to the cortex. And then lastly, which CNS structures relay this signal, and is it perceptible? Yes, it's perceptible. It goes from the thalamus, right? If we do convey this, which we should if it's painful, it'll go up to the thalamus, right? The thalamus will decide to send the signal up to primary somatosensory cortex, right? This is where touch, pain, temperature is relayed. And then it will send neurons all the way to this somatosensory association cortex to piece together all of this sensory info coming in. In this case, the nociceptor is a mechanoreceptor that monitors stretch, pain, and this pain is perceived, right? So it does go up to the cortex. We do perceive this. Now, I've shown you all of these pathways. Remember, I don't need you to know where things cross, right? I do need you to know that the reason I gave you this slide is not to freak you out. It's that what it does help you with is to organize your ideas about the type of stimuli. So if it's crude touch and pressure sensations, this will go up um, these ventral columns, okay? If it is pain and temperature sensations, this will go up, it'll cross over the gray commissure, and it'll go up the lateral columns over here, okay? If this information is fine touch, vibration, pressure, and proprioceptive sensations that you actually perceive, this will go into the dorsal columns over here, not synapse. It'll go directly up the dorsal and it'll actually cross over in the medulla and then it'll go up to the cortex. Okay. And lastly, we saw this with proprioceptive. If proprioceptive information from the Golgi tendons, the muscle, blah, 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 if this proprioceptive signal is not perceived, right? If it is not thought about, such as riding your bike, you still are sending information about how you're pedaling and where your limbs are, but you're not thinking about it per se because you've done this so many times. Well, those motor plans, right? The coordinating of motor activity will go across the spinal cord, up these lateral columns, and they will go to the back over here, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is important for motor planning and coordinating movements. So we are always doing that on a regular basis. We're just not doing it often in a way that we're perceiving it, so it's not going to the cortex. But if you're learning a new dance move, let's say, you're going to need to know where your limbs are in place, in space. You will definitely require proprioceptive signals to go up this path so that it could get to the cortex. Okay? So that's pretty much it for our pathways. These pictures, again, I don't need you to know where it crosses, but I want you to understand each of these sensations and what these are very good to understand what columns information are going to. And over here, I gave you full of practice, 3 pages of practice, so that you can start practicing some ideas of what we just looked at from the past 2 lectures. Okay, so I will leave it at that for now.